Welcome to another Striper Season Update brought to you by West Marine. We're just a day past the June full moon and stripers are starting to settle into their summer haunts. You can still get some good fish in New Jersey. Schooling and slot-sized fish are still in the surf. The bigger bass in Raritan Bay seem to have moved east out along Long Island. On the south shore of Long Island, you'll find big schools of adult menhaden and big stripers hounding them. There's good fishing off the north and south forks of the island as well, with Montauk starting to fire up and the fast waters off the race also holding big bass. The Connecticut River is still a hot spot with large stripers eating adult menhaden, and Narragansett Bay is still holding fish into the 40 and 50 pound range. Block Island is starting to fill up with big bass, and some big fish are starting to move through the canal into Cape Cod Bay all the way up as far north as Boston. On Cape Cod, you'll find stripers eating a variety of bait fish depending on where you're fishing. In the Monomoy rips and the rips off the south side of the Cape, bass are feeding on squid. In the canal, it's been large menhaden that have been attracting big stripers into the ditch. In Cape Cod Bay and off Race Point, the big bass seem to be feeding on mackerel. Boston Harbor continues to fish well with fish as large as 50 pounds being caught, and 40 pounders have made their way all the way up to Maine. Some of the migrating stripers have already reached the places where they're going to spend the summer. And you think of summertime striper haunts, you might think of iconic places like Block Island and Montauk. We're going to talk about another iconic striped bass spot with this week's guest, On the Water publisher Chris Megan, who's going to share his love of fishing the Elizabeth Islands in Massachusetts.
Welcome everybody to another Striper Season Update brought to you by West Marine. We got a special treat today along with Jimmy Fee and myself, Kevin Blinkoff. We've got Chris Megan, the publisher and owner of On the Water, here to join us. And Chris today is going to talk about some place that's really special to him, the Elizabeth Islands. For anyone who doesn't know, the Elizabeth Islands come off of Cape Cod. They form pretty much part of Buzzards Bay, south of New Bedford, stretch all the way from Woods Hole to the famous striper island of Cuttyhunk. Chris, you've been fishing the Elizabeth Islands for many, many years. So let's just get started right there.
I have a question. Are they technically an archipelago?
100%. That's the definition of an archipelago, right?
It doesn't have to be formed by volcanoes? We should have looked this up.
I'm not even sure what an archipelago is. I thought that was an old wooden ship.
I thought we promised Chris we weren't going to use any three-syllable words or bigger.
Not everyone went to Cornell. A couple of us went to Villanova. So I guess that would be...
Nothing wrong with a safety school. So Chris, why don't you go ahead and get us started? Tell us a little bit about when you started fishing the Elizabeth Islands. Bring us back to those days of wooden ships and hand lines.
Well, we had just gotten the cod on board and salted it. And I first started fishing the Elizabeth Islands when I first came down in the early 90s. It was a place that Bill Hoff, who was the owner and publisher of the Enterprise newspapers, where I came down. I came down to be the director of sales, then became the general manager, and was in the newspaper industry. And it was funny because I was a journalism major at Villanova, but wanted to do TV sportscasting, but actually came up on the advertising side of things. And I met Bill Hoff back in early 90s, I want to say 92, and 91, early 92. And that summer, I came on board with the Enterprise. He brought me down the Elizabeth Islands on a 17 Montauk Boston whaler. And I fell in love. I just fell in love with the Elizabeth Islands. It was just like a place I hadn't seen before on our coast. I've been to Ireland in 1985 with my then girlfriend, now wife of 33 years, and it reminded me of the coast of Ireland. It was just, very remote, it seemed. The first part of the island, which is towards the North Shore, at the beginning of it, the Hadley's Harbor in that area, is definitely inhabited. I think the Forbes family owns a big portion of that area. But once you get past that kind of Hadley's Harbor, Lackey's Bay, Cheech knows that well. He's been in there, very intimate. I think he took a lower unit off in there on my Skeeter. But that's a story for another day.
But you digress.
Yeah, I digress. I absolutely digress.
I see what you mean, though, Chris. I mean, you get further down, they do have kind of those rolling hills there. Not a lot of trees on the islands. There's some, but it's mainly
and that was kind of like the coast Jimmy of Ireland. That when you were down there, just because the wind would always kind of keep any of the growth down to that, small pines and such. And so when we first started going down there, it was like, we went to this first spot. Bill said, this is my go-to spot. We caught schoolies. They weren't big fish, But as we started going further and further down, and we made our way towards the end of Nashon and on the pass, you started seeing some of the bigger boulders that hung just off the coast there, and started recognizing some locations where big fish would hang out. And I fell in love with it. Started skating in the men's hockey league when I was 29 down here. I had to wait till I was 30 to play in this league, really very competitive league. And I met one of the guys on there, Eddie Balzerini, who to this day, you guys have heard his name multiple times. I shake a little bit when I still say his name. Eddie's a good guy, but he introduced me to some of the captains down at Cuttyhunk. And what we used to do is go down to Cuttyhunk with George Isabel. George Isabel on the line sider would put us up for a week, and we'd be down there, and we would stay in this right on Cuttyhunk Island on the second floor with a back deck, and we'd fish 2 tides every day, and we'd be down there for 4 days fishing. And he really gave me some tremendous insight as to kind of the boulder fields in and around Cuttyhunk, in and around Pask. Roland was another captain down there. I'm trying to think of Roland's last name. He passed away a couple years ago, but he was another guy that just kind of gave me an introduction. But you look at some of the captains that were down there going back 30 years ago, and the experiences that they had fishing in and around there. And so I bought my first boat, which was a 22 Shamrock. And it was the perfect boat because it had a full skeg on it, deep keel, and my prop was protected. So when I would go down there and I was learning, I was bouncing off of rocks on a regular basis. And, and I had no electronics on this boat. There was nothing legal about it. Which it had no lights on the thing. We used to run back at like 3 or 4 in the morning, and I'd have to hold a flashlight out there, or I'd have Neil Larson hold a flashlight out there. I'm not sure if my port and starboard lights actually worked. I had no electronics for fish finder or anything like that. I had a handheld radio that sometimes I would leave at the dock. And so when I look back on those days, it was there wasn't a whole lot I was doing right, except for I was learning the Elizabeth Islands, and I was learning about electronics. So I learned it the hard way. Our skeg bounced off the rock 2 or 3 times on each trip, and it was okay because it was a full skeg protected on the bottom side of it. But it made you really learn the islands, like every nook and cranny and every rock and every bump and every structure and every cove, and where we could go inside of the rocks and where we couldn't go inside of the rocks. And I guess my favorite was fishing nighttime, throwing eels. Just throwing eels at nighttime to me was just, heaven on earth down there. There was no white lights. You'd be fishing along, Pask or one of these other things. The moon would be your only kind of light as far as your shoreline. My eyes were better then, so I could see where the whitewater would break with the waves. And you'd look out there and you'd see a coyote just cruising along the shore at 2 a.m. And you just but you had a feeling when you were fishing back then that on every cast, you were going to do what Charlie Soares did, or Charlie Cinto and Charlie, who's the other Charlie, Jimmy?
There's Charlie Soares and Charlie Cinto, but it was there's another Charlie Cinto who had the 73 with aboard the June Bug back in the 60s.
Charlie Haig, right? Was
Charlie Haig, thank you. I think also had a 73 that I think didn't that come from down that way?
Charles Church.
Charles Church. Okay, thank you. A lot of Charles in there.
Yeah, so there's a 3-way tie for the Massachusetts state record striped bass, all 73 pounds. 2 of them are from along the Elizabeth Islands.
And the other one is the third on the backside. There are
73 pounds on Nauset Beach.
73 pounds, right.
The first one is Charles Church, and that was 1913. And I think that was it Pask?
I want to say it was Pask. Mm-hmm. And then I think that Charlie Cinto, which we went out there and did a TV show with him, and we kind of tried to, replicate what he did that day that he was out there. And I think everyone thought he caught that fish at Cuttyhunk, but I think that fish was Pask as well. I'm pretty certain. I think that fish was Pask as well. There's a ledge out there.
I think the story at the time was he told people he was trolling. They were trolling Goo Goo plugs, and he said he was doing it out at Sow and Pigs. But in truth, it was by Pask Island, is the way it's been told to me by Charlie Soares.
Oh, I didn't know that.
That's what it was, because I know that when God rest his soul, when we were out there with Charlie Cinto and we produced that, he came clean and said that fish was actually caught over by Felix's Ledge, which is, I think, where Charlie Church's fish was caught as well. And I used to fish that with it, and his name will come back to me. I know Charlie Soares fished with him many, many times, but Roland ran a boat out that way, and I fished with Roland back in the day. He was one of the nicest guys, hardcore. Cuttyhunk, lived out there. And the thing that was cool about Cuttyhunk when I went out there is you learn very quickly that of the 25 to 30 year-round residents, everybody out there had a job. So like you pull up and I'm like, Roland, what's your job now? And he's like, I'm the fire marshal. I also manage the boats down at the harbor as a harbor master, and I'm the assistant backup on the diesel engines, and then 2 years later, the job would change. But Roland was definitely not the DPA guy down there, because when I went fishing with him, every fish ended up in the box. I'm like, Roland, that's short. Fits in my frying pan, throw it in. God bless this man, and God rest his soul. But I just used to laugh at the time that we were out there once, and we had 2 firemen from Natick, and I was on board with Roland. He goes, "You're mating today." And I'm like, and every fish these firemen caught, I'm like, "That's a short." I go throw it back. He pulled me aside and he said, "You throw another short back, I'm going to put a gaff in your neck."
Sounds like a sweetheart.
That was his softer side. But all kidding aside, I learned a lot from those guys. George Isabel was probably one as good as it gets. He ran the line sider on a 29 dyer. And we would go down the islands. We'd fish salmon pigs at 2 and 3 and 4 in the morning with Eddie, Leo, this guy that owned a liquor store up in Taunton. He used to come down. There was 3 other guys that I met through him. 4 of us on the boat. We'd be on a 29 dyer. The only light on the entire boat would fit inside of a $50, and it was the depth gauge. So he would be working the tiller in the far, far back of the boat, looking out at the depth gauge that was on the size of a $50, and it was probably right at the station, the head station there. And that would be the only light in the entire boat. You'd have 2 fiberglass chairs facing backwards. He would be facing the bow. You'd be facing the stern. And we'd be running J-plugs, just swimming along the edge. And you knew you were fishing along the salmon pigs, because you felt like you could literally reach out and touch the waves. And the waves would be standing up. When the wind was against tide, the waves would be standing up what felt like 4 and 5 feet. And he'd be running along, and he knew these at night, 2 o'clock with no lights out there. He knew the salmon pigs. All of them did. But George was especially good at it. He knew the rock structure and where he was at any given time on salmon pigs based on the waves on our side, the rip line on our side, and the depth on this $50. That was the only thing that he had, was like 6 feet, 5 feet, 4.8, 4.4, 4.5, and then he knew he'd swerve out around a rock. What was the coolest thing is we would be swimming these J-plugs with a single hook. And the action on them was crazy. It was kind of like the action of a dock, but underwater slightly. And it would just dart. And when your rod went down, you just knew it was a big fish. So that hooked me. Just the beauty of the islands and getting down there hooked me. And but my thing down there was fishing with Neil Larson and throwing eels at night. It was just nothing better.
You told me when I first started working here, you talked about how that was as close to surf fishing as you could get from a boat. You said you're casting to basically where the surf guys are standing with those eels.
Yeah, it was funny because one of our old writers back in the day, Steve Shareka, used to shoot down there with Dave Laporte or whoever else he could grab. There was a doctor in town that I can't think of his name. It'll come to me. But the 2 of them would slide down
Art
there.
Crago?
It might have been, I don't know if it was Art Crago. Art usually stayed in a boat, but what Steve Shareka would do with Laporte would be to, and then what's his name? Ski was another guy that I think sometimes we would shoot down there. Worked at Woods Hole. They would shoot down there. They would cut into Robinson's Hole, which was the first break down the Elizabeth Islands when you headed down. Nashon, break of Robinson's, Pask, break Quicks, Nashawina, and then Cuttyhunk down there. But what they would do is they would pull into Robinson's, tuck up on the shore. There was some sand on a 13 or 15 foot small flats boat. Put it up on there and jump on Pask Island, and then they would walk the shoreline over to Cobley Beach and work that inside cut. So they were actually surf fishing where we were boat fishing, and we'd be casting within each other. And I remember being down there one night at 3 a.m. and looking over, I swear I saw Sasquatch.
Shareka was a big guy.
Shareka was 6'7", and it just saw this person walking along the shoreline that looked like Sasquatch with the arms flying, but he had a rod in hand. And I knew it wasn't him because the guy behind him looked more like a garden gnome. He was much.
So speaking of Sasquatch, what other have you ever seen anything else weird down when you're on the islands when you're out there at night?
You know what? I'll tell you what. I've seen a lot of things down there weird. When you're fishing, and you're fishing down there at 1 and 2 and 3 in the morning with no lights, and you're just drifting around. There's no noise. There's no white lights. You see all sorts of things. You've seen massive deer right along the shoreline. You could have cast over them, with full rack, 12-point deer. But we've seen a lot of stuff. You swear you see, you swear you see ghosts and shit down there at nighttime. But I will tell you, and I think this is what Kevin's leading to. I was down there with Jay Baber, who used to work for us going back in the day. He really kind of helped us launch our TV show back 18, 19 years ago. And he had a little bass boat that was like not made for salt water. It was a little bass tracker. And he wanted to learn it. So I brought him down there in his boat. We fished down there, brought him down to Quick's Hole. We were fishing this corner of Felix's Ledge. And we were fish after fish on every cast, fishing this. Back then, we had some really nice eelgrass in and around Felix's Ledge coming off that structure off of Nash Marina. And Jay had tied into a beautiful fish, just a gorgeous fish. And he had fought it to the back of the boat, 36 to 40 inches on a live eel. And I went to kind of handle it, but we weren't using a lot of light. It was still, if you turn the light on back then, you might find 3 other boats and somebody would scream at you, turn the light off. So we never really used much of the light, And so we were in Quicks. And I'm bedded down and I'm following his line down. I've got the leader and I'm following it down and I'm going to lip this fish and I'm looking for it. And something goes overhead. And to this day, I don't know what it was, but it was the brightest yellowish orange light that went overhead. It illuminated us. It had to be 1:32 in the morning. There was no light anywhere. And all of a sudden, as I'm looking down, I see not only the fish, it's bright enough that I can see structure below that's probably 10 feet down. It was like somebody took a floodlight and put it over our head and it came overhead of us and it went out. And as soon as it came in, it went by. It didn't fly by like an asteroid. It went overhead slow enough, like just illuminating us. But the coolest thing about the whole thing was this warm feeling that came over you when it came across, and I could see the entire fish. And I could see Jay. He had a little, because it was a bass boat, he had a little bass seat. And Jay was up towards the front of the boat in the bass seat. I was landing fish. And I could see him as if it was in a Walmart parking lot, and at nighttime with all the lights on. And it kind of went, and I lipped the fish, and I looked at Jay. I'm like, what is that? And as soon as it came in, we never saw a plane overhead. We never saw anything overhead. It was just a light that came overhead. It passed down along the islands and disappeared.
The temperature rising is the freakiest part. I mean,
the temperature went up at least 10 to 15 degrees. You just felt this warm, comfortable blanket that came over you because it was in the fall. It was definitely end of September, early October. And that's when we used to get the big fish. That was the fall run was it. That was everything. So we were down there. And I'm with Jay, and he goes, I don't want to talk about it. And I'm like, Jay, did you feel it? I don't want to talk about it. And I'm like, Jay, but you did feel it. He goes, I felt everything. I saw everything. I don't want to talk about it. And so we drifted out a little further on. And the next thing you know, we were really close to another boat. And then we started yelling over the boat, did you guys see and feel that? He goes, the dude yelled over, what was that? And he goes, yeah, I thought it was just us. So they came closer to us, and another third boat heard us kind of talking. They kind of came into the mix. At this point, we're out kind of drifting towards the middle of Quick's Hole, and this other boat came out. This day, I don't know what boat it was, came over and he goes, holy shit, what was that? All right, getting back to it, just to land that plane or whatever that was that went overhead, that was it. It was funny that we all drifted out to the center of Felix's Ledge. There was 3 of us, 3 boats out that way. We all talked, and to this day, I don't know what it was. The next day, Jay and I talked a little bit about it, and we kind of looked in the news to see if anything had come out of Otis Air Force Base, that would have caused something like that. Never saw anything. Looked up and down the coast as far as any of the news, and never saw anything. And I did hear from one other person that was fishing out of Cuttyhunk that day that said that they saw and felt the same thing. But to this day, I don't know what it was. It was the weirdest, coolest thing. And I imagine there's a lot of people out there that fish at nighttime that could share similar stories of stuff that goes by. that way. But that's kind of also the mystery in the magic of fishing at night, though. I think is that you never know what to expect from a big fish on the end of the line to something going overhead that you can't explain. I think that's the coolest part about it.
So, of the coolest, like let's call them confirmed species out of Cuttyhunk, I always think the when you drive by, is it Nashawina that has the Scottish Highland cattle on it?
It is Nashawina that has a Scottish Highland cattle on it, and it's funny. You'll see them anywhere from Pask to all the way to the other side where the Canapixit is coming into Cuttyhunk. They have a free roam of that island, which is another reason why it reminds me of Ireland. That you'd be on, when we were over there. Emery's, my wife's family, all were cattle herders and raised them, and to see the stock there. Oh boy. Hold, please. All right, boys. Getting back to it. So yeah, there's a big cattle there that come in, and what's cool about them is I've been down there along. They lived at the islands in August when the water's really warm. Fishing that inside corner there by Pask, right as you turn to Buzzards Bay and start heading down along Nashawina, and the cattle will come and just like bathe in the water. They'll come in to cool off. They'll go right up to their shoulders, and cool off. But it's such a cool area. Another story that I think these guys would like would be, so there's a group of guys that I fish with would be, it's called Fish in the East. A really good group of guys. We all old baseball players that played baseball back in the day. And that was kind of our connection. We love fishing. We love baseball. So Neil Larson and I started, I got introduced to the guys from Fish in the East from Neil. We go down to Cuttyhunk because I introduced him to that spot. We go down there and we'd stay at the Cuttyhunk Bass Club, one of the coolest places on earth. Not much has changed in the last 125, 130 years. And so we would go down there and we'd stay down there. There'd be anywhere from 14 to 16 of us, 4 boats. We'd split up and we'd have like 2 or 3 days of fishing in the fall. And so one fall I'm down there and we're fishing, and Henry O'Shaughnessy's on his boat, the Gaelic Wake, which is a 2640er. And he calls me over, hey, something's swimming in the water. In between Pask and Nashawina, there's a deer trying to swim the current as it comes across. And it was a 10-point deer with a drop tine. So that is like, that's that one that comes down versus going up. It's the coolest deer coming across. So Henry calls me over, I zip over to it, and Henry's the two of us are following this deer, and Henry with his big diesels kind of pushing this deer, and it's definitely an old deer, and this deer is like starting to swim as hard as it can to get through the current and get away from this 26 Dyer that's just, 40 that's running up on him. And so we're coming up on the side of him in our 22 Skeeter, and it's getting close to the Pask. It's about to make it, and all of a sudden this deer just comes up and right up on the side, starts foaming. So Neil's like, that thing is drowning, it's drowning. So Neil runs it up. I go up to the bow, and I grab the rack of this deer, and I'm pulling it out of the water, and I'm trying to keep this deer's head above water. It's throwing foam out of its mouth and spitting. And I'm like, Neil, let's get it up on the shore. The deer will be fine. So he's speeding it up. I've got the deer's head up like this. And we bring it in, and we get it up on the shore, and it's just foaming out of the mouth. I think it had a heart attack because a diesel boat was running up on one side and a Skeeter on the other. It was working as hard as it could to get through current and away from us. And I think this deer ended up having a heart attack. And what ended up happening was we get up on the beach and kind of put the boat up there. Neil jumps out. We get the deer. I drag it up on the shore. Neil starts giving it like compressions on its chest with his foot. So true story. Neil is like on his foot, and he's got his foot on where he thinks the heart would be, and he's giving it compressions to see if we can't get the heart started and pump a little water out of the lungs in the meantime.
I've never heard of any whitetail catch and release tactics before.
Yeah. So we were doing everything we could to catch and release and help this deer out, and the whole time I'm like, if this thing comes to, he's getting gaffed, and so this deer expires on the beach. So we called down to Cuttyhunk, and we're like, hey, we told them what happens, and they're like, it's hunting season. We probably should have left it right there. And one of the guys on the island is like, you got to bring the deer back. That'll feed a bunch of families here on the island. You got to bring it back, And then he goes, I know the deer, and I can't remember the gentleman's name. So long story short, we take the deer, throw it up on the bow of the Skeeter, and we're leaving on the 22-foot Skeeter. But before I leave, I hog tie the 2 back legs to the port side of the boat, up on the bow, and the two front legs to the starboard side cleats. And I hog tie this thing in because I just have this feeling that when we're running back to Cuttyhunk, this thing's going to pull a Tommy boy, you know, you know, and just come alive and just trash the entire boat while it's looking to either jump back in the water or do both Neil and I harm. So I'm hog tying it. So by the time we pull back into Cuttyhunk Harbor and we're coming through, it's like 9:15 at night. It's last light because and 9 o'clock at night, last light. And I'll never forget, this is 20-something Grady White coming out of the harbor. And the kid on the bow says, "Dad, we fished all day and couldn't catch a thing. And these guys caught a deer." As we're passing them coming into the harbor, and we've got this deer with a 10-point, on the bow. And I'll never forget the kids saying, like, they caught a deer out there fishing, and we brought it in, they diced it up and they passed it out to the island folks. And but yeah, that was another one of those really strange kind of like, what probably should happen on Cuttyhunk could stay on Cuttyhunk as far as like bringing the deer back without a tag and such. But those are days gone by, and it wasn't really me; it was Neil Larson.
Statute of limitations has got to be up by now. So.
There's a lot of statute of limitations. Like earlier talking about an unregistered boat, I'm hoping that's expired too.
So back to the fishing.
Is that what this is? Is this a fishing show?
We could, if we're sharing Cuttyhunk stories, there's a time I went down there with Chris and we boat fished our way down. Then we got to Cuttyhunk. We stayed overnight in the Bass Club. I surf fished, and I thought Chris and I were going to leave in the morning. And I woke up and I felt like Kevin McAllister because Chris was gone and the boat was gone. And I like went to the Cuttyhunk club bathroom.
Yeah, that's a true story. But you came down.
You're home alone to me on Cuttyhunk.
Well, you fished with us. That was a Fish in the East one that you came down and you fished with fish. But you took off and you fished alone. And some of the guys wanted to go nighttime fishing. And Jimmy's like, "No, I'm a lone wolf. I go out on my own." And that's where the Fish in the East guys gave Jimmy his nickname, Jimmy Me. Instead of Jimmy Fee, it was Jimmy Me because he was going off to fish by himself. He wasn't taking any of these guys with him. He didn't know what their capabilities were, and Jimmy was not going to take them down, or more to the point, have to drag them back up the cliff because there were some big boys for Fish in the East.
So why did you leave him there?
I thought actually he had left during the night on another boat. I didn't know if it was like he was with a different captain, and he was off on his own. And it was definitely a Home Alone. It was definitely a Home Alone moment.
I made my boss disappear.
That was another great story talking about fishing. So we just started the Striper Cup, and all the guys. One of the first groups in there was Quantum. They were a Zepco brand owned Quantum. They had Van Staal, they had Finor, and Zepco. And the president of the company, Jeff Boltice, who turned out to be a really great friend, they were all here and they wanted to come fishing. We invited them to the Northeast. We put 3 or 4 boats together. We brought them down the islands. We fished between Devil's Bridge, which is just off of Gay Head. We fished between No Man's Island, Devil's Bridge, and Cuttyhunk. But Cuttyhunk was my stopping ground, so I brought those guys out there. I was with John Kushner, who was the marketing director, dear friend, Jeff Boltice, and Bob Bagby. Bob Bagby. Isn't
it Dave Boltice?
What did I say? Oh, I'm sorry. It wasn't Dave Boltice. Senior moment there. It was Jeff Pontius. Dave Boltice was I think president with Costa. But Jeff Pontius was the president with Zepco at the time, and really good guy. He came down, hadn't done a lot of striped bass fishing, if any at all. And so Bob Bagby, who was an old bass fisherman, understood, the bait caster setting up, and he fished it because when you fish down along the islands, you're really fishing it almost like you would fish freshwater bass. You're working structure, you're throwing in among docks, you're throwing in among grass, eelgrass, rocks, anything like that. You're fishing kind of like you would fish a shoreline if you were a freshwater bass fishing along structure. So he picked it up right away. He was catching fish after fish to 35 pounds. And he just thought this is the best fishery he's ever been. It was like middle of the day, October. That's what it was like back then. And I should say end of September because they were out here, I think, for the Striper Fest. And so Jeff Pontius was just getting madder and madder. You could tell in a competitive way at Bob Bagby catching these fish. And all of a sudden, Jeff has the rod off his side. He's looking at another one of these Bagbies, and his rod just horks over, and his rod just starts screaming. But what happens when you're fishing in along the Elizabeth Islands is these fish you're catching is in 4 feet of water, 3 feet of water, 5 feet of water. And oftentimes they'll just head to shore or they'll go parallel to the shore and they're running in and among rocks. So this fish took off, wrapped around a big boulder. Jeff's fighting it, but I can see the rod tip, ping, 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 just very unconventional the way the line's leaving and how it's wrapped around the backside of the rock. So I'm like, Jeff, flip the bail, flip the bail, flip the bail. They go, flip the bail. And I'm like, flip the bail. You're either going to snap it off on the back of the rock or you're going to lose that fish just trying to pull it on the backside of it. You stand no chance that way. Flip the bail. We're going to run to the fish. So he flipped the bail. Neil got on the stick. I got to the bail, kind of held the back of him. We went up to the rock and we popped the rod off. We went over the back of the rock. We popped the rod. Went to the next rock. Neil backed it off the rock, brought it to the next rock, popped it off of that. By the time we got it off, the fish had actually, during free spool, had swum out into the open, Vineyard Sound. And then we turned, we freed up, we went out, put the line tight again, came tight to it, had a good hook set. And you see this tail just flash over on the side. Fight's on now, but we're in good water. And we fight this fish, bring it to the side. His first striped bass he ever catches, 52 pounds. And I'll never forget it because the line that Neil said, which was perfect, which may have to get edited here, but Jeff goes, "This is unbelievable. This striped bass fishing is great. It's incredible. Man, I got to come back. It's unbelievable." And Neil goes, let me put it to you like this. You just lost your virginity to a supermodel. It's never going to get any better than that. So very quickly, Jeff Pontius put 2 and 2 together and said, okay, I guess this is a fish of a lifetime. And Bob Bagby, from that point on, looked on it like, how did that guy get a 52? And he has never done any really bass fishing. So that was another cool story down along the islands.
One of the points from that is it's such a different place to fight fish, too, it being shallow water. I mean, compared to, say, another big fish fishery like the Block, where you're fishing, 40, 50 feet there? I've never fished out of Block Island.
Yeah, so the Block Island, you're fishing. I fished out there now, enough times to realize, it's funny, we did a shoot down there once. I took the Skeeter into, Ocean Marina, and then we came out of that at 1 o'clock. We had no right cutting through there, shot across the block, fished that, and then I brought the boat up the next day. And we fished anywhere from 30 to 50 feet of water over structure, pretty easy drifts and all that. The difference when you fish the islands is that when you have moving water, you're not going to get the 4 and 5 knot currents, but you are going to get the 2 to 3 knot current, which is just perfect. That 2 knot current is like a lazy river going down along the islands. And we would know every rock, every nook and cranny. We knew when we could kind of dart in a little bit. All I would do is turn the Yamaha engine in a little bit. That might give us a little bit of a nose in, and then turn that engine back out. I'd kill the engine, and it would just slide along that way. Every once in a while, I'd start it up. But you get these drifts along the islands where if you did whack something, which we did on the bottom there's a little skeg, believe it or not, on the very, very bottom of that Yamaha engine, which I tapped more than enough times. But you would slide along there. And the thing that was the coolest thing about fishing the Elizabeth Islands, and I imagine a lot of surf fishermen feel the exact same way, but I was on the other side. I was outside fishing in. Casting to the shore, literally casting and landing that eel on the shore or just at the water's edge, and then pulling it off slowly under the cover of darkness. When you had a fresh live eel on there, as soon as that eel was going to be engulfed, it was just that nervous energy of the eel, twitch, 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 and you could just feel it. It was just different from a live eel swimming versus a live eel that's about to get eaten. And you would just get that twitch, 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 and you get that whack. And a lot of people, I don't know if they realize this, but most bass will take everything from the head. They'll come up and they'll take it by the head and they'll come in. Bluefish will come up from the tail and work its way in. That's why you get that dead pogie, the taft gone. But a bass with a live eel grabs it right in the middle. It grabs it right in the middle, and I've just seen hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of teeth mark on fish that you either the fish that you caught and the eel's still hanging in its mouth, or the fish that you missed and the eel comes back, and it's a perfect mouth that comes over the side like this. And what would happen down there, you would feel the fish, so the fish would feel you. So when you get that take, I always told everyone that I brought down there, keep that rod at a 45-degree angle anyways. And then as soon as you get it, I would bow down. This is the way I would do it. Everyone and their mother that's watching this is going to have a different way for doing it. Well, how I did it is 45-degree angle. As soon as I got that tap, I would bow down. And what that did is that gave a little bit of line to this fish, because as soon as he grabbed that eel, he felt me, and he's like, well, I've eaten eels before in my day, and I've never felt a little tug on the other end of that eel. And so they would get it. And I would give them that 2-second count, a 3-second count, where they would start swimming. They'd swim because they weren't sure about this thing. They'd swim, they'd swim, they'd swim. And then what they would do is they'd engulf it. They'd suck it right in. And when you set the hook on that fish, this is before you needed, circle hooks for everything, as things have changed in the last 2 years. But before you set the hook on that fish, as soon as you set the hook, you'd be in a foot of water, and you'd have a 35-pound bass just explode on the surface. And what was cool about it is you're kind of looking in, you're perpendicular to shore, you're looking into shore, but this fish is over to your left and exploded in and among the rocks. So now you have to do two things. You have to come tight to that fish without any structure on it, and you have to probably nose your boat in to get it off of the rocks in order to get it into clean water to bring it out. And I think that was probably what made that the most exciting fishing for me of anything that I've ever done, is fishing 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning. And the wind would usually die off. You could control your drift. It's always inevitably a southwest wind. But cruising along there, just getting that tap, 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 dip that rod, might flip the bail with a bait caster. I just, pop that down, let it go a little bit, set up on the thing and come tight. And a lot of times down there when we would fish like that, you get that glow in the water from the fire in the water. And the next thing you know, you have this fish, and you look over the side, you have a 48-inch fish that's just, the tail is just kicking fire as you're bringing it back to the rock, and you see the outline of a boulder as you're swimming it past, and you're bringing it back to you, and then catching those fish. It was just magic. It was a magic place to me. And I think because I had no electronics, I think because I had no radio, which was stupid, I think probably because I had a life jacket between the two of us, your senses were that much more heightened because that's all you had. That's all you had. And, I look back on those days now when I had 4 kids under the age of 30, and it was stupid and crazy, but it also made me the angler I am today because of the fact that I didn't need the electronics. I didn't need those things. I would never do it again.
I don't know when you made that resolution about never doing it again. I've been on some pitch black rides with you down along the Elizabeth that have definitely shaved at least a decade off my life. Just waiting for the inevitable rock, but you never hit it. I mean, it is impressive how well you can pick your way along the shoreline there.
If you put in the amount of time that we put in along those islands at nighttime, because when I had 4 kids, that was the only time I could really get out there. My wife didn't care if I went from 10 o'clock on. I had to answer the bell the next morning. But back in the day, you could do that. I know you guys do it today. I know you, Jimmy, you fished, backside of the Cape, all over the Cape, places you never share with us. But I know you put your time in, as does Katie puts her time in. And I know there's a few of us that in the office that put it in. I don't burn the midnight oil anymore like I used to. But that was magic time for me in getting down along the islands. And the last story I'll tell you about that 22-foot shamrock, which was cool, was that my compass was off 60 degrees. I realized early on I had a bubble or something on my compass, but I had to just autocorrect for that. I just knew that if I needed to run 120, it had to be 180, And so I would go out, I would leave Quicks, or I would leave down along the islands. I would steam out to the middle of Vineyard Sound, and I knew my point back to Falmouth Harbor. I can't remember the time, it was like 65 degrees. So I'd have to adjust it accordingly by 60 degrees. And more often than not, we'd be running back in fog, and it would be until we got within a half mile of Nobska Light, you'd finally see that, that was another warm blanket. It was like seeing that and being like, okay, we're going to make Falmouth Harbor and pull into Falmouth Harbor. Or back then I was in Green Pond and slide into Green Pond at 3 in the morning.
Couldn't just buy a new compass, huh? Had to go with the one that came with the boat.
Yeah, we definitely went with the one that came with the boat. It was funny. Your maintenance was non-existent. You didn't have time for it back then. It was just like I don't know, raising 4 kids between the ages of 1 and 5.5 was like maintenance went to the side. But it was the Elizabeth Islands are a cool spot. The fall was always the time of year. Things have changed though. Now I find that that's probably like June and into July are probably your best time. Right around now, down along the islands is probably your best time. It was
The fishing hasn't been quite the same down there. I mean, you see the hot spot shift over the years. You know, Block Island. I don't think when you were doing real well along the Elizabeth Islands, certainly weren't hearing about the kind of numbers that you hear about these days off Block. You know, Boston Harbor's the hot spot now too. It's just you know, it'll come back around. It seems like they always some things are cyclical. You know, start seeing the big fish spots.
thing that I would add to that is like when I was a young man, and Jimmy, you learned this probably earlier than most of us, but when I was a young man, I was in my late 20s there, and I got a big striped bass. It was new to me. It was newer to me. I fished as a kid, but it was mostly freshwater, but it was newer to me that way. So you get the big striped bass, you hold it up, you pound your chest, and you get the photo, and you take it home and you'd fillet it, and it wasn't the best tasting fish, but it was fine. You dress it up, and it was great fish. The older you got, the more proficient you got at fishing, the more that you respected the fish and wanted to let them go. And unfortunately today, I think anglers have to be that much more conservative, and I think they have to be that much more of an advocate out there because two things that have changed since I fished then. I had no electronics. Today, the electronics are such that with side scan, I can run a 200 or 300 foot swath out to my right side, out to my starboard, and out to my port, where I'm covering 500 feet of water. And once I locate that school, I can throw it on, mega side scan if it's with Humminbird, and I can lock into the point that I can pretty much tell the size of those fish. And so when you're able to catch fish that way with the electronics that exist today, you have to be that much more responsible to that stock, to that fish. And the other thing that I think has made it so, is this right here. This cell phone right now has made it such that there's no secrets anymore, because once you move it from one friend to the next friend, first friend swears he's not going to tell anyone, but as soon as he tells his next friend, the loyalty doesn't exist between the third friend and the first one, and then it's off like wildfire on social media. And so we as anglers have to be just stewards, of that fish, especially the striped bass, because we used to go down there. I would bring anyone that wanted to come down there, and we catch 20 to 30 fish a night, and they were the smallest fish you catch was 20 pounds. That would be the smallest fish you caught. Majority of them between 25 and 35 pounds. And it was how many you would catch as many fish as you had live eels, and that doesn't exist anymore.
One thing that I always found surprising, 10, 15 years ago with the Elizabeth Islands was it was a place that you could catch big fish during the day throwing eels. Like that Jeff Pontius fish that you mentioned, the president of Zebco, that 52 pounder, that was in the middle of the day.
It was the middle of the day. And you know what it was? It's because they had the structure they had, Kevin, and because there was deep water next door, you had the best of both worlds. These fish could slide 30 feet off the shore and be in 40 feet of water, 50 feet of water. And so if they wanted to dart up during the day and come into the boulder field, they were leaving 50 feet of water where they felt they could drop off that first shelf into some nice cool water and come up into the warmer water on the shores, cruise it, and come back down. And they also had the structure of just boulders the size of Volkswagens that they get hide behind and ambush prey even during the middle of the day when the water was clear. And so you had a lot of locations down along the islands because of the structure. That's why they got the name down south, rockfish. That's where they want to live in amongst. And to have those boulders down along the islands, to have the structure, and to have the deep water down there is where those fish could just come up, force bait up against the shoreline, and then ambush them and then slide back into the deep if they needed to.
What bait do you think they're eating in that shallow during the day? Was it porgies?
Yeah, I think they had scup in there. I think that, if you go down along the islands down that way and you fish, there's juvenile tautog, especially in the fall when that bite was unbelievable. I think they used to get the juvenile tautog. Back when I used to fish a lot more down at the Cuttyhunk, I remember taking a fish down there, and it had a lobster and probably 8 to 10 crabs, and the crabs were stacked up like poker chips. And it was in the fall, and I think that you get that green crab on the outgoing, where these fish could sit in some of these different places where you have a washout, depending on, there's one in Pask, there's another one on the backside of Cuttyhunk there, where you get a little bit of a washout and such. But to me, they'll anything from green crabs and lobster to juvenile to tog to whatever size they can take to the scup to the bunker. It's funny. I never really back in the day never really saw a lot of bunker down there. I never saw a lot of bunker, and so we weren't really swimming those. We were swimming either like eels mostly was our go-to, or Danny plugs. Danny plugs down there when we were casting.
Yeah, I know Captain Dave Peros, he spends a lot of time fishing along the islands. He's mentioned that in recent years, especially with more menhaden or bunker around the islands, when there is menhaden bunker around, that's all the fish will eat. And if you get commercial fishermen, or if you get any fishermen who come in with live bunker or cut bunker and they start fishing, he's like, all of a sudden he goes, I can't get them to eat a live eel. I can't get them to hit a plug or anything else. Once they get on that bait, that's all they want.
That's a really good point. You see more and more of that, and it's funny that I think that, and it's probably for another conversation down the road, which we should circle back on. But I think this resident fish that used to go to different locations, and whether or not there was which was a school of resident fish that would hang between Devil's Bridge, just off of Gatehead, Noman's Island, and Sow and Pigs. I think there was a group of fish that was their home waters. That was their triangle. That was where they did it. And they may move into Quick's Hole, or they'd be on Devil's Bridge. But the captains coming out of Cuttyhunk would be like, it's Devil's Bridge. They shoot across the way, or it's backside of Noman's. They shoot across the way. But these were more or less the same fish that kind of stayed within those waters. And you saw it on the backside of Chatham when the commercial fleet would get on them and vertical jig in 80 feet of water, 90 feet of water and vertical jig, and these fish would sit out there. We saw it for the last few years, just off of Scorton, between Scorton and Barnstable Harbor. You'd have a big school of fish that would come through, but the problem is because the electronics are so good and social media is so popular these days that it's easy to get on a school of fish that concentrate in a set area year in and year out, and to almost decimate that entire school, to the point that I think it'll be a while before those ones that the real numbers come back to Devil's Bridge, Noman's, Sow and Pigs. Not to say they're not getting fish that'll move through there, but I think we're seeing a lot more of these fish that move outside, beyond the EZ zone, that bypass Cape Cod, come up, on a squid bite or sandale bite, and then end up circling around and coming into Boston Harbor and actually heading even points north, from there.
Yeah, I think fishermen have definitely become much more efficient. The technology has helped us do that. The side scanning sonar is the one you brought up, Chris, and it's funny. There's kind of a parallel story to that Cape Cod Bay bite that you're talking about, where those fish were always there before guys had side scanning sonar. It's just it took a lot more, let's say, a little more grit to find them, because I've talked to guys who fished that 15, 20 years ago, and the way they would find the fish is they would turn off all their lights and their electronics, have one guy hanging off the bow of the boat, and just putt along real slowly until they saw the fire, and they knew that fire was a school of stripe. Yeah, they spooked the big school of stripers, then they'd start casting the eels. And that's how they found them before they had electronics that could tell you there was a school of fish 150 feet off your starboard side.
Because there's no structure to speak of there. That you're looking at coming off the beach there between Scorton and there's a few humps between Scorton and Barnstable, but for the most part, that's just going to be a slow, steady drop off. When I got my diver's license back in the day, that's where we went. We went down to Sandwich, we dove, and we swam out there, and you would see the fish out there. If we were lobstering or anything like that, if you picked up a lobster and it was a short, if you dropped it behind you, the bass would literally just hang there like a puppy dog and suck that thing in. If it couldn't make it back to the rocks and it was a short, there was a chance there was a bass that was hanging behind you, waiting to pick up some low-hanging fruit. But if you haven't dove that area, it just gradually fell off. There was definitely some structure out there you can find. So it wasn't a location that you looked at like Billingsgate Shoal, that like, yes, they're going to be on this shoal that's sitting out here. And so to your point, Jimmy, I think that's the technology being what it was today. You could be cruising out there and doing grid patterns until you found them. And once you found them, it was easier to stay on those fish. But that makes it so that we have to be that much more responsible.
Yeah, you mentioned that those fish probably the same ones going through to Noman's and Devil's Bridge. I mean, if you look on a map, those areas are all fairly close together. You could see that. And those were bites that also around the same time that you're talking about that the Elizabeth Islands were fishing so well, that the commercial fleet, again, off of Gayhead at Devil's Bridge, there were a lot of fish in there and there were a lot of boats. I remember Noman's around the same time period. You guys did a TV show out there, which was so cool. Middle of the day, I mean, bright sunlight, that clear water. and you're throwing live eels around Nomans and getting, just like you were having 30-pound fish chasing the eel back to the boat. I remember it was just unbelievable fishing there.
I took out, at the time we were working with bluefin boats. Harry Turner let me take a 27. We went out there, we filmed, and I had filmed with, I think, twice Tugas the day before, and we had done really well with twice out that way. And I took the 27. I brought my brothers out that didn't do a ton of saltwater fishing. We brought them out there. We were fishing this on the southeast corner. There's a ledge that comes up. We were fishing that. We were whacking fish to 35 pounds. Really nice fish like that. When it died out, I went inside on Nomans on the east-facing side there. It's the point that comes off of there's a line that comes across from Martha's Vineyard. I'm trying to think of Succonesset, not Succonesset. Succonesset's on this side. Squibnocket. Yeah, yep. Squibnocket comes across. But that comes all the way across, and as it tucks in there was a little sand bowl. We went in there and started throwing live eels. We had 20-pound to 30-pound fish competing on a live eel to the point that you would have 3 on, and we were fishing them almost like we would fish mahi, where you get a large mahi, you're out in the canyons, you're down in Florida, and you would leave one mahi out there, and that mahi would be all lit up, and then you would cast around that mahi, and that mahi's excitement and coloring would bring in the rest of the fish. We were doing the same thing with striped bass. We would leave one fish out there. My brother would be playing that fish, and the other bass were literally trying to take the eel out of that fish's mouth, and you'd throw another eel, you'd hook up, and we released all those fish. But it was an aquarium. You'd be out there fishing, and the water was so crystal clear. You could see down 10 and 15 feet, and you just see schooling fish that were in that 25-pound class, schooling, all competing over a live eel that was hanging out of another fish's mouth that was hooked. But unfortunately, that I think between the recreational and the commercial, this is not just a commercial thing. When you get out there on the cut bait back in the day on the live bunker, and they would swallow this, you'd have 2 or 3 rods out the side. And when that bait got taken in, more than likely that thing was in the gut by the time they kind of turned to the next rod, brought it up in there. But we would go out on the backside of Nomans, and there was another shoot we did out there when Patrick Spiel first started with the Seville lures. We brought out the Magic Swimmer. This thing wasn't on the scene for a year. We brought out the white Magic Swimmers. We had about a 4-knot current on the backside of Nomans. We cast the Magic Swimmer. I was with Hairball Charters. Eric Staplefield, we were on the backside. I would cast that out, and I literally could just hold it. And with a 4-knot current, 3.5, 4-knot current on the backside of Nomans, that Magic Swimmer just, we looked at it first on the side of the boat, just moved so beautifully that on the larger, I think it was a 9-inch Magic Swimmer, it would just swim so beautifully. It mirrored the bunker that on that backside, and they would just crush them. And there were fish after fish after fish. But what happens there is that's where the commercial and charter boats and recreational guys would all go, and they just fish that for 2 straight weeks until those fish decided to move on. But they would get a hurt and put on them, and then they would be at Devil's Bridge, and at Devil's Bridge, and then you move from there to Sow and Pigs, and it's although I think there's been some great moves that have been made over the last few years that have started to ensure the return of quality striped bass, for generations to come.
Yeah, at the time, the Massachusetts commercial limit was 30 fish a day, and that was right. They've made some changes since to try to spread out the pressure, because what would happen is you'd have a lot of pressure put on schools of fish in a very short amount of time. It was after that Chatham fishery that I think kind of spurred that change on. But you've got a big fleet of boats taking as many as 30 fish a day, and that's just too much pressure over too short a period of time, and that's what's going to.
Back in the day when they had 1.2 million was their quota, and they would hit 1.2 million, and they would hit it by August, and then it went to 1 million, and they would hit that by September, and then it went to 880, and they would, and if they hit that, it was an extended period through October. And Kevin, you know the numbers better than me. I don't know if they got to 750 last year, and I think the number stayed at 8 and change this year. And they're not getting to it. That's a statement unto itself that the quota is not being met with the extended season and extended weeks, in days and weeks of fishing that way, which is a testament to where those big fish are right now. I know that there's been a lot of great moves that have been made, but again, that's a story for another day. But I do think it's something that we come back around to. But to come back to the islands. If you haven't fished along the Elizabeth Islands, they're still pristine. They're still really unscathed as far as, they haven't seen the boom. One of the things that was cool about Cuttyhunk was that the rule of thumb always on Cuttyhunk was that if you had property on Cuttyhunk and you were going to sell it, you usually had to ask all the residents on Cuttyhunk first if they wanted to buy it before it went open to the outside. And if it did get bypassed and went to the outside, I know a builder in town that I'm friends with that was fortunate enough to buy a piece of land from a lady that was living up in Taunton who had this in their family for many, many years. And probably didn't realize the unwritten rule of having to sell it amongst them. He ended up buying it. And I remember this gentleman telling me that for the first 2 or 3 years, people wouldn't even look at him as he built his house out there and developed it. He was on the outside looking in until he kind of established himself as, I'm not here to change, Cuttyhunk. I'm not here to change the culture of this place. I'm looking to enjoy what you guys have enjoyed.
Cuttyhunk has such a rich history. I mean, even a fishing history. It was the Cuttyhunk Bass Club we're talking about hosted former United States presidents. It's where
it was the tycoons of industry, Jimmy. Back in 1900, it was the tycoons of industry. If you owned a steel mill or an oil or any of these, I mean, it was the Carnegies of the world. It was Taft. It was Roosevelt. It was, go back to your history lessons back in the turn of the century, 1900s, when when everything was going on. And that was their retreat. That was their thing. They used to go out there. I think there was 8 bass stands that went around Cuttyhunk Island, and every bass stand went out 30 or 40 feet. And these tycoons of industry and world leaders would go out there, and that was where they could let their hair down, if you will, and fish Cuttyhunk. And then what they did, it was a dry, it was under what is it? Is it Gosnell County? I'm trying to think of what, Duke County, but it was the island was dry. So anything that you brought in, you had to bring your own liquor. And if you go to Cuttyhunk, there's a cabinet to this day that sits at the end of in the eating area, the dining area. And it's made of oak, and the walls have to be this thick in each cabinet. And each cabinet's about this thick that way. And so each individual would go out there, whether it was Carnegie or wherever it was, whoever it was that would go out there would bring their own liquor, and they had their own church key that would open it up, their box, and they would put their own liquor in there. And each day they would have a lottery that would determine who got first choice to what bass stand. So if bass stand 6 was just on fire on the southwest corner, whoever drew number 1, that was it. And they would shoot out there with a baitman, and they would fish with live lobsters. And the baitman would have live lobsters, and he'd sit below the stand. He'd swing it down. They'd put on a live lobster. I think it was just the tails they fished, cast it out there, and they would sit out there and with live lobster, not live. They'd snap the tails out, throw it out, and that's what they were fishing. But it was like, and if you go to Cuttyhunk, the Bass Club, it hasn't changed, Jimmy, much since we left you behind.
Yeah, I mean, I thought I was going to end up as a bait boy,
Yeah. What your problem was? You had hands for counting money, Jimmy.
The problem was he'd go to put the lobster tail on the hook. He just decided to eat the lobster tail.
He was eating the
shell. I'm not catching anything on these shells.
But that was it. It's one of the coolest areas out there. It was one of these areas that you had to it was a different way of life. And anyone that I've ever brought to Cuttyhunk, I always say that when you walk on there, you feel like you step back in time 50, 60 years, maybe even more now. Having fished Elizabeth Islands, I highly recommend it. It doesn't fish like it did back in the early 90s and mid 90s and late 90s. But I will tell you this, it's rebounding. I think the state and the East Coast, councils that are governing that are doing a better job. And I think more than anything, I think recreational fishermen see it themselves. And I think that's why they cut back to one fish. And I think they pretty much voted at all the meetings we went to unequivocally to go back to one fish back, 4 or 5 years ago. And now I think it's even tighter. So better days ahead. Elizabeth Island's a magical place.